My name is Prof. McAndrews, and I'm on the faculty at Salem State College. We're going to be talking about immigration today.
Excuse me, I was talking.
What else?
And more specifically, I'd like to address the issues concerning farm workers in the United States. I would like to present some information from some advocacy groups and study groups who have been paying attention to both the conditions under which farm workers practice their labor here in the United States, and also the issues of fair wages. I will also take a look at a couple of the pieces of legislation which have bipartisan support in Congress, specifically one bill called the Ag Jobs Bill. I'll be telling you in more detail about that later. And the other is called the DREAM Act. So let me begin by going over some information which I had discussed with you earlier, but I think it might be important to review some of this information for today's session. Part 2, we're focusing on immigration and specifically farm workers in the United States, both those who are documented, that is to say here with legal papers, and those who are undocumented. One of the advocacy groups working in this area is called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And Immokalee is an area of Florida where there's thousands upon thousands of acres of agricultural land. Initially, the Immokalee workers were concerned about conditions of employment which they felt bordered on indentured servitude or possibly even slavery. So just to review a few of the victories of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. In 1997, with the help, of course, of the Federal Department of Justice, a suit was brought against two of the managers of a farm in which the workers were harvesting vegetables and citrus fruit in Florida and South Carolina. The indictment noted that approximately 400 workers were working under conditions of either indentured servitude or slavery. The indictment also brought up a number of alarming practices concerning the beatings under which the farm workers would endure. And in 1999, another case, United States versus Coelho, Mr. Abel Coelho was sentenced to 33 months in federal prison on slavery charges. The indictment indicated that he held more than 30 tomato pickers in 2 trailers in isolated swamplands west of Immokalee. I could go on. There are a number of other cases, 5 specifically, in which employees of the growers were charged with indictments of indentured servitude or slavery. The most recent one was United States versus Ronald Evans in 2007. Ron Evans was an employer. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He had recruited both homeless U.S. citizens as well as undocumented workers. I'd like to show you a clip from a hearing before a United States Senate committee about 2 years ago. It begins with Senator Edward Kennedy, and it shifts to Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. And in this particular clip, you're going to hear from testimony from the Chief Detective Officer of Collier County. You will also hear from one of the Vice President of the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange, Mr. Reggie Brown, and you will hear from an investigative reporter named Eric Schlotzer. So I'd like to begin by showing you this particular clip.
Down double straight there, the right to the bottom. You got it? Okay.
Exposing the plight of migrant farm workers in Immokalee, Florida. Airing shortly after Thanksgiving in 1960, A Harvest of Shame told the story of a neglected and mistreated class of Americans who worked long and backbreaking hours to put food on the tables of families across the nation. The story shocked the conscience of the nation and compelled us to speak out against these abuses.
Last point that I would make, some may say, well, this is just a local Immokalee issue. It is a Florida issue. No, it is not. In America today, we are seeing a race to the bottom. The middle class, in many ways, is collapsing. Poverty is increasing. What I saw in Immokalee is the bottom in the race to the bottom. And if we do not lift that bottom up, every worker in this country is in danger. So it is terribly important that we understand how in the year 2008, slavery can exist in Immokalee and how workers can be treated as badly as they are.
And listen to what Senator Sanders says about the work day for these people. Many of them don't know if they'll get to work at all. And then when they come to the fields, they may have to wait an hour or more for the dew to come off the tomatoes before they can be safely picked and transported. So to suggest that these people are making dramatically more, maybe double the minimum wage in America, is beyond any credible belief.
Just coincidentally, as Mr. Schlosser indicated, when I was in Immokalee, it just so happened that there was another indictment on slavery. And I think for the average American, in the year 2008, people are scratching their heads. And they're saying, how in God's name, in this great country, in the year 2008, are people still being held in slavery? So my question to you is, do you believe that there is human trafficking happening in Florida agriculture as we speak right now, or is this just an aberration? What's going on there?
It's still occurring today. It's probably occurring most likely right now while we sit here. Workers are held, forced to work, threatened every day if they don't work. It's the conditions that they live under, the way they are forced into a debt servitude process where they pay weekly for their housing, for their food, substandard. And at the rate they're paid, it's hard for them to ever get out of that debt cycle. So they're continually, perpetually put into that situation. And then if they decide to leave or decide that they want more money from whoever they're working for, their crew leader, whoever, then they're the threats of violence.
So your point is there have now been, what, 5 or 6 indictments with regard to slavery?
Roughly, yes, Senator.
Okay, and your point is it may well be going on today as we speak right now.
I'm almost assured that it's going on right now.
Let me ask you to respond to this again. I read this earlier. This is not me, it's not Senator Kennedy, it's not Senator Durbin. This is the St. Petersburg Times, a paper I have no familiarity with other than I saw this editorial. This is what they said. Is it really going to take an act of Congress to get Florida's tomato pickers a raise? The men and women who work the fields of Immokalee earn 45 cents on average for every 32-pound bucket of tomatoes harvested. It is a meager wage that has not been raised in more than 20 years. Yet, when a couple of fast food giants generously agreed to pay workers and added penny per pound, the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange sabotaged the deal and has refused to negotiate even after congressional leaders offered to be intermediaries. The editorial concludes, the truth is that Florida's migrant farm laborers are among the worst paid workers in the state. They haven't had a piece rate increase in a generation, and the Growers Exchange wants to keep it that way even when someone else is willing to foot the bill. End of quote. You want to comment to that?
Senator, that's one view. Ours is different. We are in fact paying fair wages and we're treating our workers fairly. And in fact, the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange does not object to the penny a pound being paid by McDonald's or Yum Brands. We simply do not wish to participate in the distribution of those monies for the legal reasons we
We're
don't.
going to get to that in a second. Mr. Brown, do you really expect this committee to believe that the attorneys at Yum, the largest restaurant company in the world, and McDonald's, the largest fast food chain in the world, 26 law professors and 2 highly regarded law firms with antitrust practices are wrong? And you're right.
Senator, that is one group of legal opinions. Our legal opinion is different, okay?
So on that,
Well, one of the crucial points here is that no tomato grower is being forced to enter one of these contracts with a fast food chain. And what Mr. Brown didn't mention in his testimony is that the Tomato Growers Exchange has threatened fines of potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, against growers who want to pay their migrants the extra penny.
and finally, we need to make sure that slavery, servitude, and other abuses in the Florida tomato industry continue to receive the attention both in and outside of Congress they deserve, with the goal of ending this abomination. Needless to say, slavery is not something that could exist in America in 2008. And needless to say, the horrendous wage and working conditions that exist in that industry need to be significantly improved.
A book published by the author John Bowie called Modern American Slave Labor and the Dark Side of the Economy was reviewed in Forbes magazine. And I just want to quote one passage from the reviewer. He says that Bowie begins his investigation in Central Florida, which one former DOJ, Department of Justice prosecutor, that he interviews calls ground zero for modern slavery. Mr. Bowie had arrived in Florida in 2002 in time for the trial of Juan and Ramiro Ramos, brothers accused of operating a slavery ring in Immokalee, Florida, an agricultural area carved out of the swamps where farm workers picked tomatoes and oranges for such companies as Taco Bell and Tropicana. The United States District Court for the Southern District in Florida found that the Ramos brothers were guilty of conspiracy to hold people in involuntary servitude, among other things. The workers were indentured first to coyotes, who charged extortionate fees to bring them across the border, then to men who drove them from Arizona to the Florida farmland, and to the petty and cruel overseers who ultimately employed and provided them shelter in filthy, crowded barracks. Bowie furthers this idea by recounting the case of a Mr. John Pickle, an Oklahoma businessman who owned a welding company that resorted to slavery in an effort to compete in the new economy. He says that Mr. Pickle began employing Indian workers, paying them $2.89 and incarcerating them on factory grounds, where their grim lodgings became known internally as the Cram-A-Lot Inn. I'll read from an editorial from the New York Times just a few days ago. Many American workers know how bad economy can chain them to a bad job or a bad boss. But what if you're an immigrant guest worker and that boss holds your visa and can get rid of you with one phone call to the feds? What if he just threatened to call? Which would you choose to do? Be exploited or be deported? To suffer silently here or in destitution back home? He goes on to say that a new bill in the Senate by Robert Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, seeks to give these workers a chance to speak out. It offers temporary protection against deportation and retaliation for non-citizen workers, both visa holders as well as undocumented, who file civil rights or labor rights complaints or who are witnesses in lawsuits in criminal investigations against employers. The editorial goes on to say, this gives time for labor agencies and law enforcement to investigate claims of workplace violations, investigations that are now often short-circuited after complaints disappear. The so-called guest worker program that was referred to here goes back to the immigration reforms of the 1920s. Up until that time, from the period of the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848 through the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, there was very little, if any, border control along the Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California border. Mexicans had come and gone relatively freely depending on labor demand that many of the farm owners needed at that time. But in 1924, along with the National Quotas Act of that period, a law was instituted that attempted to regulate workers coming in through Mexico. And it was known as a guest worker program. In the vernacular of today's visas, it's known as the H-2 program. H-2. Now, H-2A stands for agricultural workers who are coming here temporarily, and H-2B stands for workers such as the Indians just referred to here as factory workers. Even though there is no limit on the number of H-2A agricultural visas that can come into this country, so there's no technical limit that Congress put on it, whereas for the factory workers, for the H-2B, there is a limit of approximately 66,000 per year. But even though there's no limit to the visas for guest farm workers, the average number of visas actually allowed, going back, say, for the last 10 years or so, has been roughly under 80,000. To get an estimate of the number of farm workers needed on the West Coast and the East Coast, you see a range of estimates. And the range, as I've been looking into this, is as varied as 500,000 to over 1 million farm workers. Vegetables, fruit, working as ranchers, farm hands, whether they're picking crops with their hands literally, or whether they're engaged in the packaging and processing and so forth and getting them ready for truck delivery. 500,000 to over 1 million have been working the farms in this country. Most studies do show that about half of all farm workers now working today on farms from Florida up to Maine, from California up to Washington, and other states in between, roughly half are undocumented, illegal. The point of many of the investigations, and certainly the concern of advocacy groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, is to help out both those who are documented, come with a proper visa and those who are undocumented. But the point I want to make is that when you hear people say that workers coming across the border, whether they're originally from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala, and those are the main countries coming across, that they should do what workers should do and go to the American consulate and apply for an agricultural workers visa. The problem that the statistics show glaringly is that these visas are not given out. They're given out at a very, very small rate. Maybe 5 to 10% of the actual labor needs are given out as farm visas. Do you see the problem? What results is you have an enormous demand for the workers. Has always been a demand in this country for over 100 years for the lowest paid of our workers. And yet these visas are not. Now the question is, why doesn't our government give out the number of necessary visas that farm growers could easily say, well, here are the number of thousands of visas I will need for my plantation this summer or this fall, this winter, and another grower will say, I mean, we have a pretty rough idea. My own feeling is, this is my theory, it has to do with the regulation of labor for the lowest wage workers in the country. I think it benefits many growers not to have an actual visa system in which the proper number of visas could be given out to workers to come here legally to work. If a worker is here as an undocumented worker, that worker can easily be exploited, be intimidated. That worker will, him or herself, find it very difficult to go to an organizing meeting that someone might call in which they're discussing issues around work conditions and wages and so forth. That's my own theory about it. But let me give you some information about the kind of things that the Coalition for Remotely Workers has been doing. So back in 2001 is when this coalition started to attempt to organize workers in Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. They attempted to petition some of the large buyers of the food products that the workers were picking. And so they looked first of all to Taco Bell. Now Taco Bell is a subsidiary of one parent company called, let me make sure I get this exactly right. Yeah. Yum. Y-U-M. Yum is a parent company for Kentucky Fried Chicken, for Taco Bell, and for a number of other fast food chains. Their attempt was to try to persuade Taco Bell to in turn put pressure on the owners of the farm fields to raise their wage a penny a pound. A penny a pound. Their letter campaign had very little effect. They had demonstrations outside of certain Taco Bells that didn't have much of an effect. So they decided to up the ante of their organizing, and they asked people to actually not go to Taco Bell. In other words, a boycott. Some of you may remember the days in the 1970s of Cesar Chavez in California in which there was a great boycott for a long time. I can't really tell you if that was very successful or not. But in the case of Taco Bell, it did prove successful. Taco Bell was the first of many fast food restaurants and then supermarket chains that made agreements with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers that they would put pressure on the owners to raise the price, the amount of money that workers would get per pound of the fruits and vegetables that they were picking. One of the pressure groups they used were college students across the United States. And at the height of their campaign, about 5 years ago, they had over 150 campuses so organized that the campuses were beginning to change their contracts in which they were not allowing Taco Bell to come on campus and sell their products. So Taco Bell was one of the first to reach the agreement. But in addition to the issue around wages and around the amount of money they were getting per pound, they were also interested in having a code of conduct. That is to say, a number of labor principles that they wanted the growers to abide by. Research by Oxfam America showed that most of the growers in the United States have codes of conduct for the treatment of animals. However, they did not have any such code of conduct for the treatment of their workers. So Taco Bell agreed, and they sat down with the coalition and they hammered out what would become a model of a code of conduct. This model was followed by McDonald's, Burger King, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Long John Silver. In a matter of 2 years, and largely because of their victory with Taco Bell, they were able to persuade many of the fast food restaurants throughout the United States to have these code of conduct principles established and to agree to the addition of 1 cent per pound for the crops. Their next big target, which just took place about 2 years ago, was to go after supermarket chains. Persuade places like Walmart, which at this point I think represents somewhere around 20 to 25% of all of the revenue from supermarket chains is taken in by just Walmart. My understanding is that Walmart is very close to an agreement with the Immokalee workers. But the first supermarket chain to agree was called Whole Foods. Whole Foods came on board right away. They agreed with the code of conduct principles and they agreed to the 1 cent raise per pound. So their campaign continues. I want to bring up just a couple of other issues with you before I show you a video clip produced by the PBS program called Now. One of the other issues has to do with pesticides. The farm workers groups, particularly in California, through the United Farm Workers, and that was the group started by Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Workers has a petition campaign that if you go to their website, you could sign on to this petition if you so chose to. Their petition has to do with pesticide spraying. And their concern is that when the planes come by with these pesticides, these planes blanket many of the home areas where the migrant farm workers live, and also there are schools and churches and playgrounds. So they would like to establish some way in which the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, can establish some regulations around the spraying of pesticides. So the EPA is looking into this at this time. The other thing the other issue that farm worker advocacy groups are looking at, and in particular a group called Farm Worker Justice. They're looking at a particular pesticide which is used in probably 20 different states, but is beginning to be banned in a number of states, not many at this point. But they're seeking to have, in California, a ban on a particular pesticide. So about a week ago, the study was finally concluded by federal national laboratories about this particular pesticide. And the conclusion from the study was, and I'm reading the last sentence of the conclusion, there's a lot of very technical jargon in their study, which is very lengthy, that I have no understanding of. But I know what their conclusion reads. This risk assessment concludes that the application of MEI, the initials for this pesticide, in field fumigation under the conditions evaluated could result in significant health risks for workers and the general population. Now, this is just one little example of an issue that I know that you're as concerned with as the farm workers are. That is to say, you and I bring home every day fruits and vegetables from our supermarkets, and we're concerned and have been concerned for a long time about how long do we wash them, do we use soap, or do we just scrape off the whole outside and make sure that none of that gets into us. And why do we do all this? Because we know that pesticides are used. And I cannot get into the argument of the benefits and the risk or cost of using pesticides at all. I know there's a growing organic movement, and I can't say I know much about that either, but I'm sure many of you do and would be proponents of that organic farm movement. But I'm sorry, I was brought up in a city and I haven't educated myself about this too much as my wife would like me to be more educated and would like me to eat my vegetables, which I don't, so I guess that's why it's not an issue for me. But apparently it is for us consumers. But I'm just asking you to think about the other person involved with this chain of food distribution, and that is the very workers who are picking all the fruit, the very workers who live in the fields where the pesticides are being used. These concerns and issues, as many of you know, are not new. As Senator Kennedy referred to the 1960 broadcast by Edward R. Murrow, Nation of Shame, that these are issues that have been talked about for a very, very long time. They've been public knowledge for at least 50 years. There's probably been bills sitting in Congress in different committees of one form or another every single year on these issues. I think what's really grabbed the public's conscience is the victories by the United States Justice Department, primarily under the Bush administration, and the Immokalee workers to actually successfully convict some of the growers, employers, and others of involuntary servitude statutes. And as I had mentioned to you before, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers received the Salem Human Rights Award last year, and were it not for that and the publicity around that, I don't know if I'd be talking to you about this issue today. And I find out that the Carter Center in Georgia is helping to support this coalition, and I think that's really terrific. So there are a number of different reasons why I think you and I have both a personal health reason to be interested in this, as well as a moral reason to be interested in this. Throughout the United States, probably the organizations that are most responsible for pushing these issues into the national spotlights are various churches and temples. So throughout the United States, there are a number of clergy who have joined the campaign to raise the awareness of the American public about the people who pick our crops. The result of the hearing to me was that the committee of which the bill that I will be talking more about, the Ag Jobs Bill, that more attention has been brought to the issue of both the conditions of workers and their wages, but as well as to the immigration status of the workers. Because the committee was interested in trying to understand what led to these kind of conditions of involuntary servitude, the abuse of workers. How does this happen? And I think the number one issue that the committees, there's two separate committees in the House and the Senate side, were looking into was that these people were easily exploitable. These people were very easy to take advantage of. And so what a number, and there is great bipartisan support for the Ag Jobs Bill, which might surprise you once I tell you some of the particulars of this bill, because basically it calls for the legalization of an awful lot of farm workers who are now here in an undocumented status. So that's where the attention seems to be. Here's why I think things are a little different for two reasons. Number one, there's more and more people who are concerned about the food they're eating. Okay? So in other words, there's a self-interest involved with this. That is to say, pesticides from the 1970s until 2010, there's far more reliance on pesticides today than there had been many, many years ago. So one concern for people to latch on to what's going on in terms of the spraying of the fields and the conditions of people, whether they're children working or teenagers or adults. So that's one issue. The other is immigration. Immigration's in the news. And people want to know, well, why are they coming? Who are they working for? How do we limit the numbers coming in? How do we solve the illegal immigration problem? Those who are here illegally and those who next month, next week are destined to come here. So there's another reason why I think the Ag Jobs Bill will definitely be part of the broader discussion about immigration reform. I know that it's going to be a very messy legislative process, but later on today what I'd like to do is focus on a little bit more on that bill, what it calls for, as well as another bill which was shy maybe 2 or 3 votes last year of getting passed, the DREAM Act, which is principally an act to benefit children under the age of 18. So first, it would provide undocumented farm workers a chance to earn legal immigration status by meeting stringent past and future agricultural work requirements and immigration law obligations. Provide the ability to legalize immigration status, and that this is key to enabling farm workers to bargain and go into a contract with their employers on a more equal basis. The second part of the bill would revise the H-2A, that's formerly known as the Guest Worker Program, which, by the way, President Bush attempted to expand greatly during his administration, but was met with deaf ears in Congress, that this would revise the H-2A Agricultural Guest Worker Program in a manner that would be fair to both the growers and the workers. So let me tell you more specifically how this legalization part would work. It's a little complicated, but not too much. It's interesting to see how one aspect of the illegal immigration problem can be addressed. Okay? And it's not a small aspect. In fact, I'd say it's one of the most important and the largest aspects of illegal immigration along the Mexican border. Two-step process. Number one, the farm worker who is here illegally, okay, does not have documented status, he or she would apply for what's called a blue card. You heard of the green card? Which is no longer green, but when it was first introduced it was. That's legal permanent residency is known as a green card. But a blue card would not grant legal permanent residency. So the first step is, yes, you'll get legalization, but it's very conditional. So here's how it would work. You apply for a blue card, which would give you temporary resident status. Under the law, the farm worker would apply for this card through a government-approved organization. The application period would begin 7 months after the law is enacted. Eligible workers are those who satisfy the following requirements, and this is what's key. The worker must show that he has worked in U.S. agriculture for at least 150 days during the 24-month period ending December 31st, 2008. In other words, the law looks back and wants to know whether or not this worker has been working here prior to 2008 and has worked here for 150 days doing farm work. So you need to prove, all right, yes, I'm coming forward, I'm admitting that I'm undocumented, and I'm going to prove that these were my employers, this is when I worked, and so on and so on. Must prove then, or must have, is eligible on the basis of not having committed a felony. Remember we talked last week about felony law, or a misdemeanor that involved bodily injury, or the threat of bodily injury, or harm to property in excess of $500. So in other words, the person's criminal background check, which would be done, must not show that the person has that kind of a misdemeanor or felony. And then finally pay an application fee and a fine of $100 in obtaining the blue card. So that's to get this temporary blue card. But now here's the second step in the process. To earn legal permanent residency status, after obtaining a blue card, the participants must do the following to earn a green card. Number one, they must perform agricultural work for at least 100 work days per year for 5 years. Now what's interesting about this law is that there's a similar requirement, similar, not the same, for young people who came here when they were children, graduated from American high schools, and they're seeking to have legal status. And that's called, the DREAM Act pertains to them. For that group, and I'll get right back to the agricultural group, for the young person who is undocumented, but now has graduated from high school here in Massachusetts or wherever, this person must show that I came here when I was a youngster, I was under a certain age, 12 years old, whatever. I obtained my degree, so that's looking back. Now the looking forward part of the DREAM Act is you also have to show that you are going to finish military service or college within a 6-year period. While you are establishing that condition for the future, you will get conditional legalization. But only when you finish one or of those criteria will you be given legal permanent residency. Do you understand? So the model of the DREAM Act is somewhat similar to the general perspective of the Ag Jobs Bill. It looks back at your record, and it looks forward in terms of saying, if you are going to take advantage of our conditional legalization, this, they call it blue card, you must fulfill 5 years now as a farm worker in the United States. What has to be changed for today and the future is, well, what kind of visa requirements do we want, and what numbers are we talking about for farm workers in the future? That was the part that earlier I said that approximately 80,000 or so of those visas are given out every year, when in fact we need many, many more. So that's a different issue and a different part of the law which President Bush tried to address and Congress ignored him. They're going to get back to that part of the law. They have to. So even if immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, is put off until the fall, I think that Congress could still take a look at some current issues, like the Ag Jobs Bill, like the visa program for farm workers, and make some reforms on that level. It's similar to what happened with healthcare. You had those arguing, don't do anything unless we have something that looks like a whole package. Something in which everybody will be dissatisfied that supposedly solves the problem. Whereas others were arguing, can we get past certain parts of healthcare that we feel are critical and crucial? Let's just pass those. So in immigration, I think we're going to be faced with a similar tension between the advocates that want to deal with the whole picture and those that are saying, can we take this apart? Can we take a look at children? Can we take a look at farm workers? And let's see if we can deal with those issues. And border security, right? What do we want for border security? What is the proper way for the federal government to respond to the new Arizona law? Because as you know, the federal government must respond. So I don't think the federal government has the luxury of sitting back until the fall or next Christmas to say, well, we're finally going to address what Arizona has been trying to address. It's going to have to deal with this because the courts are going to be backlogged with things. Now, I know that you're probably very interested to talk about the Arizona law, and I would like to get to that. But let me bring you back to farm workers and back to the Ag Jobs Bill. So I said that they have to make an agreement that if they're going to get this legal permanent residency, a green card, they've got to work for 5 years, stay here, commit no crimes, and they can get this green card. If this kind of thing happens, it would be a tremendous reform in this country. I say that because we have never been treating the lowest paid workers, the most exploited workers. We've never been treating them fairly. And I think the time is right to begin taking a look at it. There has to be some way to be able to say, this person has been here, and this person's been working in this field of work for a certain period of time. And
It's like college.
it's not too unlike the 1986 law that also looked back but also looked forward. People who had their legalization adjusted from illegal status to legal status on a law that we still have on the books that says if you've been here for 10 years and you can prove what kind of work you've been doing and this and that, you can potentially apply for legal status. So that logic of the way in which the law has looked at someone's illegal status and how do we then change that to legal status, it has always demanded of the person themselves that they are going to have to prove certain things. Where have you lived? Have you had a clean criminal record? Have you been working? And there may be further requirements too. Either they've been paying into Social Security and paying federal taxes, or they may be hit with a fine that could kind of make up for some of that. There was nothing in the guest worker visa law that really required that employer to really verify a whole number of aspects, including wages. But the other part was more important. When that worker from Mexico or Guatemala or wherever got that guest worker card, either work in a factory or farm, he only got it for that employer. He could not say, well, now I'm here in Florida and I'm picking for this grower, but I'm not getting the wages I was promised and I'm exploited. I've heard about another farmer in another county. I'm going to go work over there. That farmer who first had him will notify immigration and he will be picked up. In other words, he can't take that visa. It doesn't travel with him to another employer. Under the Bush plan, that was going to be abolished. He would allow, the guest worker program reform would allow a worker the independence of taking that visa to another employer. That would be a great benefit. And those are the bare outlines, the two major steps of how a legalization process could work with respect to agricultural workers. And as I say, it roughly parallels the way in which Congress has been looking at possible reform that affects children and young teenagers. To the best of my knowledge, neither law addresses the idea of, say, a federal ID that everybody carries. There is a law out there. Congress has been debating this for years to look into it. And I really don't have a lot of information on the pros and cons of that. So I'm kind of neutral on it. I can just instinctively, I can hear the voices for and against. And I'm sorry that it doesn't raise my passion as much as some of these other aspects. So that's why I'm not really focusing on that. But I know for some people on the whole argument of legalization and immigration problems, on both sides of the federal ID issue are very, very passionate. What I'd like to know is what the impact would be, say, on farm workers, let's say, because that's what we've been looking at here. And I don't know the answer to that, but that would be one of my concerns. And why? Because, well, we've got the potential of reforming that aspect for them. Let's say that the courts uphold the Arizona law. All right, you know there's got to be federal court challenges. All right, preemption issues, federal preemption law, other civil rights violations, potential. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that those lawsuits fail and the Arizona law is upheld. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that it is. Okay. All right. So, what is the economic impact on the state? I'm not sure overall, but what I would like to know is, what impact does that law have on farm growers in the state and others who are relying on them. So I want to thank you all very, very much for attending. You were a great group, and don't forget to keep educating yourself on these issues. Pay particular attention to the Ag Jobs Bill and to the DREAM Act. Thank you very, very much. Crops are all in and the peaches are up. The oranges piled high in their creosote dumps. We're flying them back to the Mexican border. Pay all their money way back again. When my father's own father, he waded that river. They took all his money he made in his life. My brothers and sisters came working the fruit trees, and they rode that truck that they took up and died. Goodbye to my warm, goodbye Rosalita. Adios, mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call me deportee. of us are legal and some are not wanted. Our work contract's out and we have to move on. 600 miles to the Mexican border. They chased us like outlaws, like rustlers, like thieves. Now some of us, we died in your hills and we died in your deserts. We died in your valleys, we died on your plains. We died neath your trees and we died in your bushes. Both sides of the river, we died just the same. The sky plane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon, like a fireball of lightning that shook all our hills. Who are all these friends, all scattered like dry leaves? The radio says they're just deportees. Is this the best way we can grow our big orchards? Is this the best way we can grow our good fruit? Fall like dry leaves to rot on the topsoil and be called by no name except deportees. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you is D.